A steel door crashes shut. And in that exact moment, Karmelo Anthony disappears. Not physically, legally,
Socially.
almost psychologically. 1 second, he's the name dominating headlines across the country. The next, he's just another number inside a correctional system that doesn't care about trending hashtags, courtroom drama, or public opinion. But here's where the news takes a turn almost nobody sees coming. Because Karmelo Anthony wasn't immediately thrown into a prison cell. He wasn't instantly placed with hardened inmates. And he definitely wasn't prepared for what happened during the next 48 hours. Instead, he entered a hidden world most people never hear about. A world of classifications, evaluations, secret files, risk scores, and decisions being made behind closed doors that could determine the next several decades of his life. Think about that for a second. What if strangers you've never met were quietly deciding where you'd sleep, who you'd live around, and how dangerous your future was going to be? Sounds unbelievable, right? Well, according to sources familiar with the process, that's exactly how the system works. Tonight, we're pulling back the curtain on the shocking reality of Karmelo Anthony's first 48 hours behind bars. The intake process, the psychological evaluations, the classification decisions, and the harsh reality waiting for a 19-year-old stepping into a world he can no longer control. Because, trust me, the deeper this news goes, the darker it gets. The first thing they took wasn't Karmelo Anthony's freedom. It was his identity. No dramatic speeches. No final warning. No moment straight out of a Hollywood prison movie. Just paperwork. Stacks and stacks of paperwork. The moment Karmelo stepped through the intake gates of state prison, the system began stripping away every trace of the person he used to be. The clothes he arrived in?
Gone.
The personal items he carried?
Gone.
The routines he had known his entire life?
Gone.
Everything was removed and replaced with something far more powerful.
Control.
And that's when the reality started hitting him. Because until that moment, prison had been an idea, a possibility, a sentence spoken by a judge in a courtroom. Now it was concrete.
Steel.
Locked doors. And officers who viewed him as another file moving through the machine. But what happened next is where things become truly unsettling. Most people assume new inmates are immediately assigned a cell. They're wrong. Karmelo wasn't heading to permanent housing. Not yet. First, the facility needed answers. Who was he? How dangerous was he? Could he be trusted? Would he become a target? Or would he become a problem? Those questions were about to determine almost every aspect of his future. The prison intake unit looked less like a prison block and more like a government facility designed by people who had forgotten what comfort looked like. Bright lights, cold walls, constant surveillance, no privacy, no escape, every movement observed, every conversation monitored, every reaction noted. And according to people familiar with the process, this is where the real evaluation begins. Not with handcuffs, not with locked doors. With observation. Karmelo was photographed from multiple angles. Fingerprints were taken. Records were reviewed. Background reports were examined. The system wanted a complete picture. And here's where things became complicated. Because Karmelo wasn't a typical inmate. His case had exploded into public attention. News coverage, online debates, community outrage, endless arguments about guilt, punishment, and responsibility. Inside prison walls, publicity creates its own problems. Famous inmates attract attention. Attention creates tension. And tension creates risk. The facility knew it, which meant Karmelo wasn't being viewed through the same lens as someone whose case nobody remembered. Every detail mattered. Every factor was considered. Then came the medical screening. And despite what many people believe, this wasn't about compassion. It was about liability. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice, TDCJ, needed to know exactly what condition Karmelo was in the moment he entered custody. Any injury, any medication, any physical limitation, everything documented. Because once he was inside, responsibility shifted. And responsibility creates paperwork. Lots of it. Doctors asked questions. Nurses reviewed records. Examinations were conducted. Files expanded. Meanwhile, Karmelo sat waiting as strangers quietly assembled a profile of his entire existence. But that was only the beginning. The next stage was the one correctional officials often consider the most important: mental health evaluation. Imagine being 19 years old. Imagine hearing a sentence measured in decades. Imagine walking through locked gates, knowing your future suddenly looks nothing like the life you imagined. The system understands that kind of shock. Not because it's sympathetic, because it's predictable. Adjustment problems happen, breakdowns happen, desperation happens. The facility wanted to know exactly where Karmelo stood psychologically before placing him anywhere permanent.
Questions were asked.
Responses were recorded. Behavior was observed. And every answer became another piece of a much larger puzzle. What nobody tells you about prison is that classification isn't just paperwork. It's strategy. The wrong placement can create violence. The wrong housing assignment can create conflict. The wrong decision can create lawsuits, investigations, and headlines. So the system tries to predict problems before they happen. And that's exactly what they were doing with Karmelo. Somewhere behind administrative doors, officials began reviewing information most inmates never see. Criminal history,
Age.
sentence length, institutional concerns, security factors, potential vulnerabilities, potential threats. Everything entered the equation. And one factor kept standing out: 19. 19 years old. Old enough to enter the adult correctional system. Young enough to face challenges many older inmates never experience. Youth inside prison can attract attention, sometimes the wrong kind, which means placement decisions become even more important. The officials reviewing Karmelo's file understood that. They weren't evaluating who he used to be. They were evaluating who he might become. That's a huge difference, because prison systems don't simply react. They anticipate. They calculate. They attempt to forecast risk. And Karmelo was now being measured by formulas, assessments, and classifications that would influence years of his life, maybe even decades. Then came the security review, the process most inmates fear, because this is where numbers start appearing: risk scores, custody levels, housing recommendations, administrative assessments. On paper, it looks ordinary. Inside prison, it's everything. One classification can determine who you live around. One classification can affect your movement. One classification can influence opportunities, restrictions, privileges, and safety. In many ways, that number becomes your new identity. And Karmelo knew the decision was coming. He just didn't know what it would be. Hours passed. Then more hours. Doors opened. Doors closed. Names were called. Instructions were given. The machine kept moving. Relentless. Methodical. Unemotional. Exactly as designed. Outside the walls, people continued debating the case. Supporters argued. Critics celebrated. Comment sections exploded. Opinion videos spread across social media. But none of that mattered here. Inside state prison, public opinion carried no weight. The system had one objective: determine where Karmelo Anthony belonged. And as the first day slowly turned into the second, that answer was getting closer. Because hidden somewhere inside an expanding file was a decision. A decision capable of changing everything: where he would sleep, who he would meet, what dangers he might face, and how the next chapter of his life would begin. The officials reviewing his case were nearly finished. The evaluations were ending. The reports were complete. The recommendations were being finalized. And Karmelo was about to learn a lesson every inmate eventually discovers. The sentence handed down in court isn't always the moment your new life begins. Sometimes that moment comes later. Sometimes it comes quietly. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a single classification decision made by people you've never met. And for Karmelo Anthony, that moment was now only hours away. By the time the second day arrived, Karmelo Anthony had already learned one brutal truth. Prison doesn't move fast. It moves precisely. Every delay means something. Every closed door hides a decision. And somewhere inside state prison, people Karmelo had never met were finishing the process that would quietly shape the next chapter of his life. Then it happened. The classification review. No dramatic courtroom, no jury, no cameras, just administrators studying reports, evaluations, risk assessments, and recommendations. A few signatures, a few approvals, and suddenly a teenager's future looked very different. Because this wasn't about what Karmelo thought of himself. It was about what the system thought of him. And those are rarely the same thing. The officials reviewing his file weren't asking whether he was sorry. They weren't debating the trial. They weren't scrolling through social media arguments. They were asking one question: where can we place him without creating a problem? That sounds simple. It isn't, because every inmate brings risk. Some create violence. Some attract violence. Some become both. And according to correctional experts, predicting which category a person falls into is one of the hardest jobs inside any prison system. Karmelo's age immediately stood out. 19.
Young.
Inexperienced. Entering an environment filled with people who had spent years, sometimes decades, learning prison culture. That alone created concerns. Then there was the publicity. Outside those walls, people still recognized his name. Inside those walls, recognition could create a completely different set of challenges. Attention has value in prison, and value often creates danger. The facility knew it, which is why every factor was examined again, and again, and again. Finally, a determination was made. Karmelo would receive his initial housing assignment. The waiting was over, but the uncertainty wasn't. Because receiving a housing assignment doesn't mean you figured prison out. It means prison is finally figuring you out. That night, as movement echoed through corridors and steel doors opened and closed throughout the facility, Karmelo faced a reality that millions of people watching from the outside would never fully understand. The headlines were gone. The courtroom was gone. The debates were gone. Now there was only routine. Wake-up calls.
Counts.
Schedules. Rules. Restrictions. A world where every hour belonged to somebody else. And that's when another realization began setting in. The sentence wasn't 35 days, or 35 weeks, or even 35 months. It was 35 years, a number so large that most people can't truly process it.
Think about that.
Entire careers begin and end in that amount of time. Children grow into adults. Cities change. Technology changes. The world changes. Yet inside these walls, Karmelo would wake up tomorrow facing the exact same reality. And the day after that. And the day after that. Meanwhile, outside state prison, the news refused to disappear. Supporters continued questioning the outcome. Critics insisted justice had been served. Online arguments intensified. New theories appeared. Fresh debates exploded. And despite the conviction, one question still refused to go away. Was the legal battle actually over? Because while Karmelo was adjusting to prison life, another fight was already beginning. A fight that could potentially reshape everything. His appeal. And what happened next would leave both supporters and critics watching very closely. Because sometimes the biggest courtroom battles begin after the verdict is already over. Just when it looked like the news had finally reached its ending, another chapter quietly began. Because while Karmelo Anthony was learning how to survive inside state prison, his legal team was already making moves outside the prison walls. And they moved fast. Very fast. In fact, according to court records, the appeal process began almost immediately after the verdict. Now here's where things get interesting. A lot of people hear the word appeal and imagine a brand new trial. New witnesses. New evidence. Some dramatic courtroom surprise that changes everything. That's not how it works. An appeal isn't about replaying the case. It's about attacking the process, the rules, the decisions, the procedures that led to the conviction in the first place. And according to people following the case closely, that's exactly where Karmelo's legal team believes their opportunity exists. Because somewhere inside thousands of pages of transcripts, testimony, objections, rulings, and courtroom arguments, they're searching for something powerful enough to reopen the fight. One mistake, one legal error, one ruling that an appeal court might view differently. That's all it takes. And suddenly a case everyone thought was finished becomes front-page news all over again. But here's the part that makes this situation far more complicated than most people realize. Winning an appeal doesn't automatically mean freedom. It doesn't mean the prison gates swing open. It doesn't mean Karmelo walks home. In many situations, a successful appeal simply means one thing: another trial. And that's where the gamble becomes enormous. Because a new trial creates new risks, new jurors, new arguments, new outcomes. Nothing guarantees the result would be better. In fact, it could become worse. Much worse. Imagine spending years fighting for a second chance only to discover the second chance carries even greater consequences. That's the reality facing Karmelo and his legal team. Every decision moving forward carries weight. Every filing matters. Every argument matters. Meanwhile, life inside prison keeps moving whether the appeal succeeds or fails. The counts continue. The routines continue. The restrictions continue. And every day looks remarkably similar to the one before it. Outside the facility, however, emotions remain intense. Supporters continue insisting there are unanswered questions. Critics argue the jury already delivered its answer. Both sides remain convinced they're right. And social media? Social media remains exactly what you'd expect. A battlefield. Thousands of opinions. Thousands of arguments. Thousands of people certain they know what really happened. But here's the uncomfortable truth. None of those comments will decide Karmelo Anthony's future. The courts will. The correctional system will. And time will. Lots and lots of time. Because while headlines come and go, prison operates on an entirely different clock. A slower clock. A colder clock. A clock measured in years instead of days. And for Karmelo, that clock has only just started ticking. Which brings us back to the question that continues dividing people everywhere. Was this the final chapter? Or merely the beginning of a much longer news? Right now, nobody knows. Not the supporters. Not the critics. Not even the people closest to the case. What we do know is this: a teenager entered a system designed to control every aspect of his life. An appeal is already underway. And somewhere ahead, another major decision is waiting. The kind of decision that could change everything all over again. The next chapter hasn't been written yet. But one thing is certain. A lot of people will be watching when it finally arrives. Oh, here we are. A case that started with a few chaotic moments. A confrontation that lasted seconds. And consequences that could last a lifetime. Karmelo Anthony is now inside a correctional system that will control where he sleeps, where he works, who he interacts with, and how every single day of his future unfolds. But despite the verdict, despite the sentence, and despite the prison walls now standing between Karmelo and the outside world, the news is far from over, because the appeal process has already begun. New legal arguments could emerge, court filings could raise new questions, and future decisions could dramatically affect what happens next. That's why this case continues to capture so much attention. Not because people agree, but because they don't. Some believe justice was served. Others believe there are still unanswered questions. And that divide isn't disappearing anytime soon. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been sitting in that courtroom, what would your verdict have been? Do you believe the outcome was fair? Do you think the appeal will change anything? And perhaps the biggest question of all, do you think this news is truly over? Or do you believe an even bigger twist could still be waiting around the corner? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read far more of them than you might think, and I'm genuinely curious to see where people stand on this case. And if you enjoy deep dive breakdowns that go beyond the headlines and explore what happens after the cameras leave, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because the moment a major update happens, the moment new court decisions are announced, or the moment this news takes another unexpected turn, we'll be here breaking it all down step by step. Until then, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, sometimes the choices made in a matter of seconds can shape the rest of a person's life.